Good evening and welcome to Aware on the Air, presented by members and friends of AWARE, a local peace group. The name AWARE stands for Anti-War, Anti-Racism Effort. I'm Carl Estabrook. We're recording this at noon on Tuesday, May 16th, in the studios of Urbana Public Television, Urbana, Illinois. Our subject is the wars the U.S. government is waging around the world. In the 1930s and 40s, the countries most responsible for war in the world were Germany and Japan. Today, the one country most responsible for war is the one for which we're responsible, the United States of America. In the years since World War II ended in 1945, U.S. presidents have killed more than 20 million people in 37 nations. It continues to be true, as Martin Luther King said long ago, the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today is my own government. At this moment, the U.S. government is making war and killing people in Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Pakistan, Somalia, Syria, and Yemen. Thousands of U.S. troops are fighting in these wars, although most Americans are not aware of it. In addition, the 70,000 members of the U.S. Special Operations Command are active in 3/4 of the countries of the world. Their activities include kidnapping, we call it rendition, torture, and murder. As the rest of the world recognizes, but Americans don't, they are nothing less than American death squads, out to get bad guys, as they say, who might be thought of as affecting American interests, usually financial. Furthermore, our government is provoking new wars against countries with nuclear weapons in Eastern Europe, Ukraine, the Middle East, Korea, and the South China Sea. We rightly deplore radical Islamic terrorism, in spite of the fact that the U.S. government set it up 40 years ago to use against Russia and cooperates with it in various places today. But we are by far the greatest terrorist regime in the world. Why is our government terrorizing the world to the point that international polls show the U.S. is by far the most feared country in the world? Not Russia, China, North Korea, or Iran. The answer is simple and horrible. The U.S. is killing people to protect the profits of the 1%, the American economic elite. When World War II ended, the U.S. was the only undamaged major country and controlled the world economy for the benefit of that 1%. In all the years since, U.S. administrations have been willing to kill people and make war to, quote, maintain the disparity, close quote, as American planner George Kennan said. The result was nothing less than 3 generations of American war up to today against people struggling to control their own countries. Since the Second World War, the U.S. has attempted to overthrow more than 50 governments, most of them democratically elected, attempted to suppress a populist or nationalist movement in 20 countries, grossly interfered in democratic elections in at least 30 countries, dropped bombs on the people of more than 30 countries, and attempted to assassinate more than 50 foreign leaders. In total, the United States has carried out one or more of these actions in 69 countries. The enemy changes its name from communism to Islamism, but the U.S. makes war against governments not under U.S. control or that prevent the U.S. from occupying a strategic position in our campaign to control the world economy. The sheer scale of suffering we cause, let alone the criminality, is little known in our country. The most numerous victims of our terrorism are Muslims. 500,000 Iraqi infants died in the 1990s as a result of the embargo imposed by the Clinton administration. And extreme jihadism, what we call radical Islamic terrorism, which led to 9/11, was invented by the Carter administration 40 years ago when the CIA rounded up some Muslim fanatics, armed them, and sent them into Afghanistan, quote, to give the Russians a Vietnam of their own, close quote, as President Carter's national security advisor said. Our anti-war group, AWARE, was established 15 years ago after the attacks of 9/11-2001 by citizens of Champaign-Urbana who realized that the U.S. government would use those crimes to justify its already long-standing attempts to exercise military control over the Middle East and its energy resources. The U.S. doesn't need oil from the Mideast, but Mideast gas and oil are needed by America's economic competitors in Europe and Asia. And so control over them gives the U.S. a major advantage over China, Germany, and other countries. A chokehold which benefits only the American economic elite, the 1%. In 2003, the U.S. illegally invaded Iraq and killed perhaps 1 million people for that purpose, and now has thousands of troops and mercenaries throughout the Mideast. The U.S. government says that we're fighting terrorism, but we are in fact creating terrorists in response particularly to our drone assassinations, which have been called the most extreme terrorist campaign of modern times, and have killed more than 5,000 people, including U.S. citizens and hundreds of children. Those of us in AWARE, like other anti-war groups in the United States and around the world, call upon President Trump to, 1, establish a foreign policy based on diplomacy, international law, human rights, and respect for the sovereignty of other nations. 2, end the wars in the Mideast and elsewhere, and stop the drone attacks. 3, cut military spending by at least 50%, and close the more than 700 foreign military bases. Neither Russia nor China has more than 12. Bring U.S. troops and weapons home, and withdraw U.S. special forces who've been sent into 3/4 of the world's countries. 4, stop U.S. support of human rights abusers, notably Israel and Saudi Arabia. And 5, lead on global nuclear disarmament. There's a lot of news about U.S. government war-making this week, but people don't get a very clear account of it in the American media, which are dominated by pro-war people and the political establishment, Republicans and Democrats alike. We'll try to give a better account tonight, beginning with Stuart Levy. Jeffrey St. Clair notes in the journal Counterpunch, indeed, war has become the nation's permanent condition. There seems to be a new one every few months. Few can keep up. And who goes off to fight them? Not many of us, or even people that we know. A new warrior class seems to have taken root. We notice them mainly from the decals on their trunks, or from the wheelchairs and prosthetic limbs, rarely encountered in the checkout line at Safeway. More and more machines were doing the war's wet work, killing nameless people in nameless regions on the far side of the world, hundreds of miles from any known base of operations. War has become the background noise, the ambient soundtrack of our time, close quote. Stuart, welcome to AWARE on the Air. It is your turn.
All right. I just wanted to mention that we have something to celebrate this week, in a sense. So Chelsea Manning, who is at least accused and was convicted of having leaked important documents to WikiLeaks. I don't think that has ever been admitted, but it's widely thought that this was involved, including the video that became known as Collateral Murder, of U.S. military in helicopters in Iraq looking at civilians, clearly civilians, on the ground and asking and receiving permission to shoot them down, and laughing about it. So this was one of the more shocking things, but also released by WikiLeaks and possibly by Manning, through Manning, were a whole tranche of diplomatic cables. And among those cables were some with the U.S. State Department's assessment of the then government in Tunisia by Ben Ali, documenting what people in Tunisia already knew, that the government was corrupt. But clearly the U.S. State Department also thought that they were corrupt. And so when these became widely released, well, this was the trigger for the Arab Spring, it seems. It was strictly triggered by a man who was so frustrated with his oppression under the state's corruption that a food seller, that he set himself afire, that he killed himself. But it was in the atmosphere of these cables, which had been released at about that time, that triggered the Arab Spring and the fall of several governments. So regardless of whatever it was, Manning had been sentenced to something like 35 years in prison after being imprisoned for several years preceding that sentence. And one of the acts of the Obama administration was to shorten that sentence so that she is to be released tomorrow, May 17th. And there are a number of groups around the country, Courage to Resist is coordinating them, who are doing things to celebrate that release. Courage to Resist has been supporting Manning throughout the process, and we should remember that she's done our country a great deal of good. So she's a heroic whistleblower.
That's an important point, and once again, it's something you'll not hear a lot about on the evening news. So pay attention to what little we do hear about what the resistors to American war making are saying and doing. Chelsea Manning being one of the most important of them. News notes this week on war and rumors of war, which, as I say, you will not hear too much of in mainstream media, includes, I think, at the top of the list, something that is of great importance, but is not directly involved with war, but may in fact be the most important development in regard to ongoing war by the United States in the coming years. It's no exaggeration to say that a new global order may well have been born in Beijing in the last 2 days. With more than 130 nations and territories in attendance, the first Belt and Road Summit. Belt and Road refers to this vast Chinese plan for integration of Eurasia, and indeed its integration with the rest of the economic world. The first Belt and Road Summit heralded the end of unipolar, Western-dominated world order that has prevailed for the last 150 years. A powerful, compelling second pole has been erected, radiating outward from China in all directions. This is a remarkable development and one that is amazingly ignored by American media. It may indeed be the most important thing that's happened in regard to ongoing war in a long time indeed. Meanwhile, in the U.S., the political establishment, and by that I mean that collection of self-described liberals plus the neocons, the Pentagon, the intelligence community, as it likes to be called these days, the spooks, I mean, this collection intends to pressure or remove Donald Trump from the presidency in order to continue the Obama-Clinton war provocations against Russia and China, their chosen means of prolonging the 1%'s world economic dominance. This is perhaps the overriding political issue in the United States today, remarkably obfuscated by the way in which the American government and media talk about what they're doing. Ajamu Baraka, who was the Green Party vice presidential candidate in the last election, said this week, and I quote, "It's still difficult to believe that folks are allowing the Democrats to divert us from the real issues that negatively impact working people and are not being opposed by either party." Baraka is referring here to the Russiagate enthusiasm, which does indeed dominate the American media. The Democrats have an agenda, he says, support the interests of the elite, in that they are using Russiagate to give them cover and divert attention away from issues like tax cuts for the rich, increased military spending, no increase in the minimum wage. It's a joke, he says. Russiagate is a joke, but the joke is on the people who allow themselves to be manipulated by this silliness. And it seems to me to be about right and astonishing in terms of its dominance of the American media.
And Kshama Savant had given a talk that recently in Seattle that was broadcast on alternative radio this last weekend, saying much the same thing. As she sees it, it's a terrible mistake to depend on the Democrats to be pushing progressive issues because it's sort of not in their DNA. That's not how she put it, but that it's a fatal mistake to team up with the Democrats when pushing, as she had already found in trying to promote the $15 minimum wage in Seattle. I think entirely Democrat Party, except for her, City Council had put various obstacles in the way of it. So she is supportive of people organizing, but not by ways of the existing established parties.
Unfortunately, that seems to be what's going to be necessary, and we can hope there will be some serious attention to that, both in terms of anti-war movement and also the social issues that need to be dealt with, everything from minimum wage to, saliently these days, perhaps health care. We need a new politics, and it's not going to be established by trying to decide whether Donald Trump is a Russian traitor or not, which is the remarkably fake story that we're getting from the political establishment and the media. In local news, and indeed worldwide news, the Art Theater in Champaign has been showing a distinguished series of films about the Middle East, and the AWARE has been leafleting these films with an informational picket, so to speak, about the situation in the countries that the films refer to. Stuart and I were there last week handing out pieces about Iran, and according to what you heard, Stuart, that even led to a question or two in the panel afterwards. Huh?
It did, and the films have been interesting. The first of them, I think it's called Cairo in One Breath, was about a subject that I wouldn't have expected to be interested in seeing a film about. It's about the practice of how the muezzins do the call to prayer in Cairo. And this had been done by the muezzin who was attached to each mosque. That was the traditional thing to do. 5 times a day they would get up and call out the call to prayer by voice or through loudspeakers. And there was a governmental move since the government in Egypt, since the 1952 revolution, the government has had both support and control of the mosques. So they centralized it. And so this had a big effect, and it has both political and artistic consequences, which they followed really nicely. The second film last week was called Sonali, I think. It was following the lives of a family of Afghan refugees who were living in Iran, as a lot of Afghan refugees are. And they were living in very modestly in a small apartment, clearly on the economically on the edge. They were on the verge of being evicted, but also the young woman is a gifted musician, and she was doing hip hop music and doing all kinds of other things in a school that was supported by the Iranian state. And so it's looking at Iranian society, at the lives of refugees, at the Afghan society that she remains a part of, and she still is partly caught in she and her family are caught in a web of constraint that, anyway. So it was really quite a nice picture. And after each of the films, those in the past 2 weeks, and also the film tonight, there's a discussion after the film, which is really quite helpful. Last week there was an Iranian woman, Nilufar Shambayati, who spoke, and also a woman from the U of I who's familiar with that part of the world. And they and people in the audience really brought out a lot that we would not have understood only seeing the film. So So do come, well, let's see. Those of you seeing this tonight, it'll be too late for you. The film will have already happened. But if the art does something like this again in future, it'll be worth attending it.
Tonight's film deals with Yemen, and we have a statement from Kathy Kelly, the director of Voices for Creative Nonviolence in Chicago, who's been our guest here in the past, about the situation in Yemen, where she has been, and it talks about the work of the group Voices for Creative Nonviolence, and also about the situation, the vicious war that's being carried on in Yemen with U.S. support and participation, and once again, that's hardly known by most Americans. Kathy Kelly writes, "This week at the Voices for Creative Nonviolence office in Chicago, my colleague Sabia Rigby prepared a presentation for a local high school. She'll team up with a young friend of ours, himself a refugee from Iraq, to talk about refugee crises driven by war. Sabia recently returned from Kabul, in Afghanistan, where she helped document the young Afghan peace volunteers' efforts to help bring warmth, food, and education to internally displaced families living in makeshift camps, having fled the Afghan war when it raged near their former homes. Last year, Sabia had been visiting with refugees in the Calais jungle who were fleeing the Middle East and several African countries for Britain. Thwarted from crossing the English Channel, a large mass of people were stopped in this refugee camp in Calais, France, from which French authorities eventually evacuated them, defying their careful solidarity and burning their camp to the ground. As part of her high school talk, Sabia prepared a handout to show where refugees are the most welcomed. One detail astonished her. In fiscal year 2016, the U.S. admitted 85,000 refugees, but Yemen, the poorest country in the Arab world, took in 117,000 new refugees and migrants and hosts more than 255,000 refugees from Somalia. Yemen is now beginning to host the world's worst humanitarian crisis. What's more, the country is regularly targeted by Saudi and U.S. airstrikes. Since we're also planning a week of fast and action related to the tragic circumstances Yemen faces, we were astounded when we realized Yemen is a path of escape for Somalis fleeing the Horn of Africa, refugees of one conflict stranded in their flight, and trapped in a country where deadly conflict is precipitating into deadlier famine. After years of U.S. support for dictator Ali Abdullah Saleh, civil war has racked Yemen since 2014. Its neighbor, Saudi Arabia, itself among the region's cruelest dictatorships, and a staunch U.S. ally, President Trump is going to Saudi Arabia this week, became nervous in 2015 about the outcome, and with support from 9 regional allies, began subjecting the country to a punishing barrage of airstrikes, and also imposed a blockade that ended the inflow of food and supplies to Yemen through a major port. This is accomplished with massive ongoing weapons shipments from the U.S., which has also waged independent airstrikes which have killed dozens of civilians, including women and children. Pummeled by airstrikes and fighting, facing economic collapse and on the brink of famine, how could this tiny, impoverished country absorb thousands upon thousands of desperate migrants? Yemen imports 90% of its food. Because of the blockade, food and fuel prices are rising, and scarcity is at crisis levels. UNICEF, the United Nations agency, estimates that more than 460,000 children in Yemen face severe malnutrition, and 3.3 million children and pregnant or lactating women suffer acute malnutrition. More than 10,000 people have been killed, including 1,500 children, and millions have been displaced from their homes. But worse is the groundwork laid for the far greater devastation of famine. Iona Craig, a world worker on these matters, writes, "In the middle of a vast expanse of gray scrubland, a rapidly growing population of more than 120 families huddle under parched trees. Escaping the latest wave of conflict on Yemen's Red Sea coast, they walked 2 days to get to this camp southwest of Taiz city. But on arrival, the scores of women and children found nothing. No support from aid agencies, no food, no water, no shelter. The elderly talk of eating the trees to survive, while children beg for water from local farmers. A mother cradles her clearly malnourished baby in her arms, close quote, a report from the scene in Yemen. Now comes word that on March 16th, 42 Somali people were killed and sustained gunfire from the air as they set forth in a boat attempting to flee Yemen. Quote, "I took cover in the belly of the ship," said Abraham Ali Ziad, a Somali who survived the attack. People were falling left and right. Everybody kept screaming, "We're Somali, we're Somali." But the shooting continued for what felt like half an hour. The attack on Yemen traps both Yemenis and fleeing Somalis in the worst of 4 developing crises, which collectively amount, one UN official warns, to the worst humanitarian crisis in the history of the UN. As of this writing, no one has taken responsibility for the strike, but survivors say they were attacked by a helicopter gunship. The boat was carrying 140 people as it headed north off the coast of Yemen. Only the Saudi Arabians and the United States has helicopter gunships. Meanwhile, U.S. weapons makers, including General Dynamics, Raytheon, and Lockheed Martin, profit massively from weapons sales to Saudi Arabia. The government is about to approve an even new and larger weapons sale to Saudi Arabia, our government. In December 2017, Medea Benjamin wrote, quote, "Despite the repressive nature of the Saudi regime, U.S. governments have not only supported the Saudis on the diplomatic front, but militarily. Under the Obama administration, this is translated into massive weapons sales of $115 billion, close quote. There's no sign that's changing in the Trump administration. At this critical juncture, all member states of the UN must call for an end of the blockade and airstrikes, a silencing of all guns, and a negotiated settlement to the war in Yemen. The worst malefactors, the U.S. and Saudi Arabia, must abandon cynical maneuvering against rivals like Iran in the face of such an unspeakable human cost as Yemen is being made to pay. U.S. people bear responsibility to demand a radical departure from U.S. policy, which exacerbates the deadly tragedy faced by people living in Yemen. Choosing a path of clear opposition to U.S. policies towards Yemen, U.S. citizens should demand elected representatives stop all drone attacks and military special operations within Yemen, end all U.S. weapons sales and military aid to Saudi Arabia, and provide compensation to those who suffered losses caused by U.S. attacks. One group of activists long functioned under the name Voices in the Wilderness, a campaign to defy U.S. economic warfare against Iraq, a form of war through imposition of economic sanctions, which directly contributed to the deaths of over 500,000 children in the 1990s. Lost in a culture of hostile unreality and an unbearable silence concerning economic warfare, we were evoking, perhaps unconsciously, the plight of refugees seeking survival. We didn't succeed in lifting the brutal economic sanctions against Iraq, but we surely learned harsh realities about how callous and reckless U.S. policymakers could be. We must ground ourselves in reality and in solidarity with the greater part of the world's people. As our neighbors around the world flee in desperation across borders or within the confines of their own countries, we must continually educate ourselves about the reality of what our nation's actions mean to the world's poor. Building towards a time when our voices may unite and be heard, we must raise them now in crying out for the people of Yemen. Close quote. That's from Kathy Kelly, a coordinator of Voices for Creative Nonviolence in Chicago, and of course it's directed primarily to the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today, our own government, which is supporting the vicious genocidal campaign going on in Yemen by our principal ally, Saudi Arabia.
One lever that we have in that respect now, I'd heard about through posting from the national group Just Foreign Policy. So apparently there's a proposal to sell, let me see, a $2 billion worth of arms to the United Arab Emirates, who have been not the leader, but they've been participating in the isolation and bombardment of Yemen. So Congress has 30 days to say yes or no, or at least to say no if they want to stop this deal. And Just Foreign Policy is saying we should ask them to do that, or ask them to insist that they not use any arms against Yemen before that the UAE must agree to that before any arms sale could go through. So this is something that's in play right now. This is something that we can ask our Representative Davis to act on. So,
and there are moves that we can take in involving the national government. Representative Tulsi Gabbard of Hawaii, a Democrat, has introduced a bill in the House of Representatives, and you might mention this bill when you rate Representative Davis about the situation Stuart was describing. Representative Gabbard's bill forbids the sale of American arms to human rights violators, such as Saudi Arabia, and also Israel, by the way, but also the countries that are involved in the horrors that we've just been describing. Representative Gabbard's bill is probably not going to get very far in the House of Representatives, but it's important that it be discussed. It's important that our representatives know that there is such a bill and there is such a mood among Americans to stop the murder and destruction that our government is involved in, is participating in. As I mentioned earlier, President Trump is taking his first foreign trip as president, and he is going to Saudi Arabia, the perpetrator of the vicious violence in Yemen. It would be very interesting if there's any attempt to lessen that violence. I don't really expect it, but an observation on the nature of warfare in the Middle East, for which the U.S. is primarily responsible, was put forth this week by probably the leading English language columnist writing on, a reporter writing on the Middle East, Patrick Coburn, writing in The Independent in London. The column is entitled, "As Trump cozies up to Saudi Arabia, war with Iran becomes more likely." Many people view Donald Trump as the most dangerous man on the planet. But this week, he flies to Saudi Arabia for a 3-day visit during which he will meet a man who surely runs him a close second as a source of instability. This is Deputy Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, 31 years old, the de facto ruler of Saudi Arabia, since his father, King Salman, 81, is incapacitated by old age. Coburn's being gentle. He's crazy as a loon, King Salman, and therefore his son is, in fact, running the government. He has a reputation for, the son, has a reputation for impulsiveness, aggression, and poor judgment in the 2.5 years he's held power. Early on, he escalated the Saudi role in Syria, thereby helping to precipitate Russian military intervention, and initiated the war in Yemen that is still going on and has reduced 17 million people to the brink of famine. Combine his failings with those of Trump, a man equally careless or ignorant about the consequence of his actions, and you have an explosive mixture threatening the most volatile region on earth. Prince Mohammed, who is also defense minister, is not a man who learns from his mistakes or even notices that he's made them. Less than a year after his father became king in January 2015, the BND, that's the German intelligence agency, issued a warning that Saudi Arabia had adopted, quote, an impulsive policy of intervention, close quote, abroad, and blamed this on the deputy crown prince, whom it portrayed as a naive political gambler. The degree of alarm within the BND about his impact on the region must have been high for them to release such a document, which was swiftly withdrawn at the insistence of the German Foreign Ministry, and one can assume Washington, but its predictions have been fulfilled disastrously in the following 18 months. The Deputy Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia is turning out to be not only a gambler, but one who recklessly raises his stakes when in trouble. Proof of this came in an extraordinary but underreported interview he gave earlier this month, broadcast on Al Arabiya TV and Saudi TV, in which he threatens military intervention in Iran. Quote, "We will not wait until the battle is in Saudi Arabia, but we will work so the battle is there in Iran," close quote, he says. Speaking in highly sectarian terms, he claims that the Iranian Shia leaders are planning to seize Mecca in Saudi Arabia and to establish their rule over all the 1.6 billion Muslims in the world. He believes that, quote, their logic is based on the notion that Imam Mahdi will come and they must prepare for the fertile environment for his arrival and they must control the Muslim world, close quote. His diatribe, Prince Mohammed's diatribe, is as anti-Shia, that branch of Islam that is in fact in charge in Iran. His diatribe is as anti-Shia as it is anti-Iranian, and likely to provoke fears among Shia in Iraq, Lebanon, Pakistan, and Saudi Arabia itself, where Shia make up a tenth of the population, that they will be victims of an anti-Shia crusade. It is absurd to imagine that the 4 or 5 Shia countries have the ambition or the ability to take over the 50 or more that are Sunni. Those Sunni fundamentalists accuse tiny Shia minorities in countries like Egypt, Tunisia, and Indonesia of plotting to do so. Prince Mohammed appears to give credence to the theory of a grand anti-Sunni conspiracy orchestrated by Iran, saying that since the Iranian Revolution in 1979, Iran has been trying to, quote, control Muslims in the Islamic world and spread the Twelver Jafari, that's the technical name of the Shia position, the Shia religious position, to spread that sect in Islamic world so Imam Mahdi comes. Imam Mahdi is a messianic figure in Shia Islam. There's more at play here than Prince Mohammed whipping up religious and nationalist feelings in Saudi Arabia to secure his own power base and fend off his rivals within the royal family. None of his foreign ventures have so far achieved their aims. In Syria in the spring of 2015, Saudi Arabia gave support to the so-called Army of Conquest, consisting primarily of the al-Qaeda affiliate al-Nusra Front and then its ally Ahrar al-Sham. This won a series of victories against pro-Assad, the Damascus government, pro-Assad forces in Idlib province, but their success led to Russian military intervention later that same year that was the turning point in the Syrian war. Saudi influence was marginalized, something he blames on, quote, former American President Barack Obama, who wasted many significant opportunities he could have seized to achieve great change in Syria, close quote. In practice, Saudi Arabia was hoping for U.S. military intervention, as Mrs. Clinton promised, to enforce regime change in Syria along the lines of Iraq in 2003 or Libya in 2011. Obama was privately critical of Saudi actions and the tradition of the Washington foreign policy establishment of giving automatic support to Saudi Arabia and its allies. Nevertheless, in Yemen, Mr. Obama gave backing until the last days of his presidency to the Saudi-led bombing campaign, which has been devastating the country since March 2015, but has so far failed to win the war for the Saudis' local allies. It has brought terrible suffering to the Yemeni population of 27 million, of whom the UN estimates that 17 million are food insecure, technical term for starving, including 3.3 million pregnant and breastfeeding mothers and children, some 462,000 under the age of 5 who are acutely malnourished, or in other words, starving. Saudi-backed forces are poised to attack the Red Sea port of Hodeidah, through which come 80% of Yemen's imports, which make up most of its food supplies. If the port is closed, then Yemenis will face the worst man-made famine since Mao Zedong's Great Leap Forward. Prince Mohammed says the war is all but won, though mysteriously, in finishing off the other side, quote, "Thousands of our troops can fall victims. There will be funerals in all Saudi cities," close quote. This is from the leader of Saudi Arabia. Trump has already ordered greater U.S. support for the Saudi war effort in Yemen, but the deputy crown prince will be primarily bidding for U.S. backing for his confrontation with Iran. That's on the agenda this week. Words are already turning into action, with reports of U.S. and Saudi Arabia being at one in planning to stir up an anti-government insurgency among minorities in Iran, such as the Baluchis in the southeast of the country, something that has been done before, but with limited impact. Saudi leaders were overjoyed by the election of Trump, whom they see as sympathetic to them and the Gulf leaders whom he will meet after he arrives on Saudi Arabia on the 19th of May, before going on to Israel. It's a chilling tribute to the authoritarian instincts of Trump that his first foreign visit as president should be to the last arbitrary monarchies left on earth, and to a state where women are not even allowed to drive. On the question of confronting Iran, he is unlikely to be restrained by his Defense Secretary, James Mattis, and his National Security Advisor, H.R. McMaster, both former generals scarred by America's war in Iraq, where they see Iran as the main enemy. The White House is doubtless conscious that the one time Trump has won universal plaudits in the U.S. from the media and the political establishment was when he fired missiles in Syria and dropped a big bomb in Afghanistan. Trump and Prince Mohammed may be very different in some respects, but both know that fighting foreign foes and waving the flag shores up crumbling support at home. That's Patrick Coburn, probably the best informed English-speaking reporter in the Middle East, talking about President Trump's upcoming visit to Saudi Arabia and its function in the ongoing American support for wars in Southwest Asia. There is a faint hope that the attempt to implicate the Trump administration into the war-making policy of the last administrations in regard to the Middle East will in fact take a turn. There are peculiar indications in Washington of internal debate within the Trump administration, and it certainly is the case that the neocons in Washington, primarily Democrats and others, are worried that that might happen because Trump during the campaign attacked the war-making of the Obama-Clinton administration. Patrick Coburn doesn't see that coming, and Patrick Coburn is very well informed, as I say, so it is not a happy prospect at all. But it'd be interesting to see what does happen in Trump's visit to Saudi Arabia, and indeed the American anti-war movement, of which our organization AWARE is part, should be publicly demanding that U.S. support for the war in Yemen and U.S. support for Saudi Arabia cease. I'd like to find ways to do that. You're watching AWARE on the Air, where we talk about the war news that you're not hearing in mainstream media and the plans of the United States government to continue to make war in Southwest Asia without any tincture of justification. Comments, Stuart?
Let's see. I don't have any immediate ones. I could start a completely unrelated subject.
We have a few minutes to do that if you would like.
Well, all right. So one of the things that there's been some discussion of on our Facebook page and on our email list recently is whether AWARE should support the the demands of a group of students on the U of I campus, the Black Students Revolution. So they have a whole series of demands, some of them specifically to their status as students, but they see these demands as quite broad. And so among them are insisting that the university should divest from companies that help countries like Israel or Saudi Arabia or Myanmar violate human rights. They talk about addressing climate change. They talk about healthcare. They really see these demands as not serving only their own interests, but as working more broadly than that. And actually, so I'd mentioned earlier Kshama Sawant, who'd given a recent talk in Seattle, and one of her comments, she said, depending on the Democrats, is the wrong thing to do, but if each group that sees itself as focusing on some issue looks only to its own issues, then we will be too weak to address any of them. It's important to team up with other groups and to express solidarity with groups that whose broad goals we support. And so she sees it as important for anti-war groups, for groups asking for national health care or a single-payer health care plans, for groups promoting labor rights, to see their problems as interlinked, as, for example, as Martin Luther King saw the triple evils of militarism, extreme materialism, and racism as being interlinked 50 years ago, and saw them as things that should be addressed together. So I wanted to make a call. Although it's late for us to support this group in particular, I think that finding solidarity that's broader than our own issues, and seeing where the core of our support should lie, but you know, we can act on our own issues, but we need to be supporting groups that are. Solidarity is incredibly important. A few months ago on this program, I'd given an example of solidarity in what might be an unexpected way that I think is worth repeating. So I heard about this with respect to a group of very poor people in South Africa, where there's a movement, the Abahlali movement. It's a poor people's housing movement. And they don't only care about housing. What they're trying to do is to get land in urban, to hold on to land in urban centers that the urban centers are trying to say, we have more valuable uses for this land, you should get lost. Look, we'll give you houses off on the edge of town where there's no access to social services, to jobs, to schools, any of that. We'll give you houses, you just get lost. And what they want to do instead is to hang on to the land that they've got and build their own ramshackle homes on it. So these people have a broad political vision. And so there have been waves of immigrants coming into South Africa from other countries, from Mozambique, from Zimbabwe, from elsewhere. And there's been a lot of violence. The government has actively opposed these immigrants. There's been a lot of violence. People will go and kill them. They say they're competing for our jobs. It's very much the same sort of thing as we're seeing here with immigrants in the U.S. There's fear and anger against these foreign intruders, or whatever they are. The Abahlali people do not participate in that. Rather the reverse. They see them as fellow poor people. And not only do they express sympathy with them, they take them into their own homes. So these are people who cannot look to the police. The police will be completely unsympathetic with them. If they bring people in and they make trouble, they're on their own. And yet they see them, they're not related to them by, even by language necessarily, let alone by national origin or by tribe, but they see they express a class solidarity with them, which is completely separate from the issue that they're focusing on as housing activists. I think that's a sort of solidarity that we should admire. And I think it's important for us in the peace movement to exploit, to participate in that sort of solidarity and to exploit the possibility of it to bring ourselves together with other groups.
Stuart and I have argued about this point before. It's my view that this identity politics is a distraction from the anti-war movement as it's existed in this country for 2 generations perhaps now. And it's important to see that that distraction is not an accident. The last president of the United States became president by co-opting the anti-war movement in 2008 and
Yes.
convincing people that a black president would naturally support the 50-year-old anti-war movement that existed in this country. He had no intention of doing so, and that's pretty clear if you read his books, particularly the book on his political experience in those years. But the rise of identity politics as a distraction from the left anti-war movement that grew up in Vietnam is not an accident. It is a conscious, calculated construction to make clear that such a thing is possible, that the anti-war movement can be undercut and set aside by appeals to progressive ideas, progressive ideals. We have any number of recent articles in the American press about the disappearance of the anti-war movement, the disappearance of the anti-war sentiments on the left in the United States, and the authors, depending on how they feel about the anti-war movement, either applaud or deplore the fact it's happened, but all agree it has happened. There's some truth in that. The greatest anti-war demonstrations in history worldwide occurred before George Bush invasion of Iraq. The invasion continued, and the politics of the last 15 years have been politics that have attempted to dispense with, co-opt, or otherwise liquefy the anti-war movement. They've been largely successful, and identity politics, as we see it in these days, is part of that alternative to left anti-war movement. Walter Ben Michaels, who's written about this well, says, and I quote, "The defensible heart of identity politics is its commitment to opposing forms of discrimination like racism, sexism, and homophobia," what Stuart has been accurately describing. But opposing discrimination today has no more to do with a left politics than do equally powerful ethical commitments against, say, violence or dishonesty. Why? Because the core of a left politics is its critique of and resistance to capitalism, its commitment to decommodifying education, to take out of the market, education, healthcare, and housing, and creating a more economically equal society. Neither hostility to discrimination nor the accompanying enthusiasm for diversity makes the slightest contribution to accomplishing any of those goals. Just the opposite, in fact. They function instead to provide inequality with a meritocratic justification. If everyone has an equal opportunity to succeed, there's no discrimination against black people or sexual minorities or what have you. If everyone has an equal opportunity to succeed, then there's no injustice when some people fail. This is the line, the sophisticated line we found taken in the Clinton campaign, which came out very strongly against discrimination, precisely to counter the critiques of neoliberalism and neoconservatism that were coming from the Trump campaign. So that's my suggestion that identity politics, why having a good heart, so to speak, it wants to overcome discrimination, has the effect of distracting from the real analysis and opposition of American war making. That's the task of the anti-war movement, and it's succeeding. Where is the anti-war movement today? Here Stuart and I are, and a few of our friends are around, but the days in which there was a mass anti-war movement in this town and elsewhere are gone. I'm not suggesting identity politics is entirely responsible for it. It's not. I am suggesting that concentration on identity politics, and indeed the bleeding off of energies in the direction of identity politics, does not help us reconstitute an anti-war movement, and that's the task before us, it seems to me.
I'm sorry, yeah. I guess we have another couple minutes?
No. Yeah,
All right.
a couple minutes. Go ahead.
All right, yeah. I don't want to suggest 3 minutes? Okay, thank you. I don't want to suggest that there is not such a thing as identity politics, or that it's or that it cannot be an obstacle to solidarity. It certainly can. And Carl, in the last few days on the email list, has brought some good examples of that. But, one of the things that divisions by race or by sexual preference or whatever get used for is to divide people against each other, to say our interests are at odds with each other, and therefore working together is not the appropriate thing to do, just as happens with immigrants, where rather than saying an immigrant is a fellow human being who shares our humanity, we say an immigrant is a person from elsewhere who is, they're not us, or whatever. It's identity politics can certainly be used like that, but to take any mention of race or sexual preference or immigration status and say this is that any political organizing that uses it is identity politics, and identity politics doesn't serve us, I think that's a terrible mistake. So I think the article by Walter Ben Michaels is in too many cases a straw man argument, and we should continue this in future.
You've been watching Aware on the Air, presented by members and friends of Aware, the anti-war, anti-racism effort of Champaign-Urbana, a local peace group, in the 20th week of 2017. Another week in which the world can see that the most extensive global terrorism is not made up just of attacks by ISIS and its sympathizers around the world, but by U.S. worldwide war-making. My thanks tonight to J.B. Nicholson for research. Our show is produced and directed by Jason Liggett, Joseph Cash, Andrew Scholarly. Thanks to him also, this program and others like it will be available on YouTube. And see the Facebook page for Aware for the articles we referred to tonight. Finally, Aware honors those who reveal the crimes of the U.S. government, which the rest of the world knows about, but Americans don't. Manning, Assange, Snowden, and others who are truth-tellers persecuted by the U.S. government. Now, this is Carl Estabrook for Karen Aram, Karen Evans Levy, Stuart Levy, David Green, David Johnson, and other members and friends of Aware, saying in the words of the late Edward Murrow, good night and good luck.